Hey folks, this is a special bonus episode of the Cult Faction podcast. Brett recently caught up with author J.J. Walsh to talk about his latest novel, The Chowderhead Crusades, which has been described as Ready Player One for the comic book world. Enjoy.
Superman.
But all right, well, I guess we're supposed to talk about the book, huh?
Oh yeah, okay. So first of all, I'm still they're just heading to where are they going to Ohio for Seagull, where his dad got killed. So I'm just on that bit. I've got about an hour and a half to go.
Oh well,
like that. So
you're
I'm not quite
the
there.
Danger room.
Yeah, past the danger room, past the different where he went through all the different things like Gorilla Grodd and all the different things and all that. Yeah. No, past all that, and then just onto the sort of they've just pretty much just met the. Oh, I'm going to get it wrong now. Is it Future Force?
Fate Force.
Fate Force. Sorry, they just met Fate Force for real, and they're coming to terms with that, and now they're on their way to stop the third act.
Well, that's great. I won't spoil anything for you.
Cool.
No spoilers. For me, the Danger Room is there's a sequence in that kind of expresses what the book's about. That's why that's kind of the retail sample on Audible and whatnot, because it kind of says it all about what the book's about. I mean, I guess there's some questions I'm supposed to.
Yeah. Okay, so I mean, how would you describe then the Chowderhead Crusades to the uninitiated? If someone's, why do I want to buy a book about comics? What's it about?
Well, if you don't want to buy a book about comics, it may not be the book for you. But if you have even a passing interest in them, I feel like it has some appeal. Just in that, I mean, I had three goals with the book really, and the first was to reconnect comic book fans with the nostalgia of their comic book experience, because I think for fans, comic books are, like a particular issue. It's like music or a smell. It'll take you back to the moment that you first experienced that issue and all the nostalgia of that. And some of these covers are burned into our brains. It's so powerful. And even if what was going on at the time in your life was maybe not that great, you get to kind of relive that bright moment of that issue or issues. And I really wanted to take readers on that journey. The second thing I wanted to do, which I think was maybe more relevant for folks who really aren't in the know about comics, is really make a statement about the positive social impact that comics and the comic book artists have made over the years. It's not a scholarly work, obviously, but I really tried to bring in some of that history and celebrate the art form and the artists and that social commentary that drove them. And then finally, I wanted to wrap all that in a action movie-esque kind of bundle of sci-fi ass-kickery with wide appeal. And while the book takes a little while to get going because it's sci-fi and you have to build that world, after that I really wanted it to kind of accelerate to breakneck pace with just short, breathers for the reader to get their legs back under them, but then go right back into it because, otherwise why read a book if it's not constant action?
No, definitely. No, you definitely get that feel. I mean, you're talking about the comics that were sort of burned into your brain then. Obviously, you've got a love of comics. And what was burned into your brain? How did this develop? Where did this come from?
Yeah, I mean, early on, that was all my dad. It's funny. He'd tell me when he was a kid, he would get his allowance, and it was 25 cents. And he'd go to the store, and he'd get a candy bar for 5 cents and 2 comics for 10 cents a piece, because my father grew up in the 18th century, apparently, but that just stuck with me. That it was that was his whole world as a kid, and he didn't really stick with the comics as he grew up. But he'd buy me one here and there as I was growing up, and kind of slowly but surely that turned into a kind of a Sunday trip to the comic book store. And there's, again, the nostalgia of that is so powerful for me that it kind of stuck with me. But as a kid, it was just, they were stories. They were great stories, but they were stories. Then as I got older, I started recognizing the social commentary that was going on, whether it was subtle or really overt. And I started developing this whole new respect and kind of loyalty to the art form. And I find myself preaching it to people. And the story that really sums that up is one that's told in the Danger Room sequence about Jack Kirby when, we weren't into World War II yet in the US, and he was angry, and Joe Simon was angry about that, and they create Captain America, and they do issue 1 where Cap's punching Hitler in the face. And to us all looking back, it's like, of course, but at the time, there were Nazi sympathizers in the US, which we forget, we willfully forget. And they showed up at the Timely Publications building. And, as the legend goes, Kirby got a call that there's some guys down here in the lobby and they want to, show you what real Nazis would do to Captain America. And as the myth goes, his response was, "I'll be right down." And because he was a street fighter, he was a tough guy. By the time he got down there, they had fled, surprisingly. So for me, that was, his art, he lived it. That wasn't just here, I'm going to draw a superhero punching out Hitler. It was, this is wrong and we need to do something about it. And if I have a chance to personally do something about it, I will. And then he and Joe Simon both went off to actually fight the Nazis. So it's so, the relationship between the art form and what was going on in the world is so powerful. And it wasn't an isolated thing. It continued right up to this day, whether it's the civil rights movement in the 60s or the civil rights movement with the LGBTQ community going on right now, whether it's direct commentary or metaphorical commentary, that's what the majority of comic books are about. And I have so much respect for the artists and the art form and the fact that they're able to express themselves in this beautiful way. So that's kind of, the love started as a kid of stories, and as I grew up, it was more of a respect and love.
So looking back now, were there any particular characters or storylines that sort of still strike a chord, stick with you? Yeah. I mean,
there's a lot, and they hit me depending on what's going on. It'll be triggered, but I mean, when I think of comic books, I think of the Dark Knight Returns, Frank Miller, the original Dark Knight Returns. That first cover is just literally it burned into my mind, and that's where I discovered. I was like, wait a minute, Ronald Reagan is in this comic book, and I was, I don't know, 10, 11, 12 at the time, and I was like, wait a minute, comics aren't just about superheroes. He's saying something about the world. And as I got into that and saw what a strong point of view he was expressing, it kind of changed everything for me and really kind of reeled me into comic books. And since that time, of course, Todd McFarlane and Eric Larson, the work they did on Spider-Man was really kind of near and dear to my heart, as is stated in the book. Yeah, otherwise it's just whatever's going on in a given day could trigger.
No, I mean, one of my favorites that gets name checked was the Green Lantern, Green Arrow, Hard Traveling Hero stuff. That was a favorite of mine, and nice to see that pop up. I wouldn't say where, I'll leave that to the readers, but yeah, nice to see that. That was a good one.
And that makes me really happy, because that's exactly what with the nostalgic thing, you connected with that and maybe some other titles, but I tried to have enough in there through the years so that people will be like, I remember when I read that. I remember where I was sitting when I read that.
Definitely. So what's on your reading list these days?
Well, obviously, I'm excited about the MODOK book that Patton Oswalt is putting out right now. It's really cool the way that's tying into the TV series that is coming out soon, that he's writing and producing. But at the very moment, I'm reading the original Secret Wars stuff to my kids, because they've been watching a lot of cartoons with Venom in them, and they've got all these crazy origin stories for Venom, when we all know that in real life, Venom came from Battleworld, and I just need them to know, the real history of Venom.
The real history. No, that's fair enough. That's fair enough. So where did then, see, you've got this whole history of comics, all these things you're reading. How did this manifest into your book? How did this manifest into the Chowderhead Crusades? Where did you pull that from?
Well, I don't think I'm going to be letting the cat out of the bag here if I say Ready Player One, because I read that book and I was like, it was so powerful for me. Again, that nostalgia pull. he's talking about the early 80s cartoons, talking about the TRS-80, the Radio Shack computer that I had no idea anybody else owned that computer, but I was like, there are others like me in the world. And so that was so powerful. And as I was reading, I was like, somebody really ought to do something like this with comic books. I think maybe I should do something like this with comic books. And that's where I began. Obviously, the book goes its own way, and I differentiated it. Specifically, I really wanted it to have, I wanted to get away from the virtuality thing. I wanted to raise the stakes and have it kind of more full contact action, but certainly inspired by Ready Player One, and then obviously my background with comic books.
No, excellent. So did you envision it as a book to start with, or were you thinking of it as a comic book or as a film, or was the book the goal?
Yeah, no, it was definitely a book from the start because, I've got a little bit of a background in screenwriting, but I find I really needed a lot of the internal character thoughts to come through, and a novel is just the best, if not the only way to convey that.
Okay, then. So with this idea you had, how did you get the idea from your head onto the page? Because there's a lot of details in there.
Well, I did an outline, which I think is a nice idea. It doesn't definitely. It doesn't always stick to it, but there was so much research. I like to think, I'm a fan, and I think at some point I thought of myself as an expert, but when you start digging into this and you start trying to really have a commentary on with the breadth that I'm trying to get at here, even though I'm only hinting here and there and here and there, I had to, reread and speed read kind of thousands of issues. And at the end of that, what I found was fascinating. I interview people at comic book shops, owners that have been at this for decades, and not one of them would identify themselves as an expert. And I actually put that in the book, in the acknowledgments, that nobody thinks they're an expert because there is too much to know. And we all are gravitating toward the stuff that speaks to us, and we kind of don't care about the rest of it to some extent. And so there was a huge amount of research involved, but the story grew organically out of the outline and the character journeys.
No, definitely. I mean, one of the things that really impressed me about the book is you really do succeed in like building a world for your characters. And like you said earlier, the world building was a big part of that. I mean, how important was that for you in developing your story?
Well, I don't think you can tell a meaningful story without strong context. And in sci-fi, you really have to build that context. So there's a lot of world building to be done. But in this case in particular, so much of the history of that world has a direct impact on the plot points. So I had to create that world because there were little levers and whatnot that were being pulled to move the characters from one point to the other. So I had to do it. And it was a lot of work. And that's why I say that the book takes a little while to get started. I'm a very impatient person. I want the action to, be page one, but I had to take about, 50, 60 pages to get the reader up to date. Where are we now?
What's going on now? That makes sense. Yeah, no. Yeah. I mean, a lot as well. You've got this crazy world you've created, and also every character seems to have their own sort of individual sort of development arc going on as they grow through. I mean, the hero Clayton Claiborne in particular, has this sort of really cool arc that develops as it goes on. I mean, did you plan out each character in advance, or was it something that grew out of the writing process for the characters?
I think that more than an outline was the driving force for the story for me, and I think it always is when I'm writing something, because the events, where people go and what they say can kind of evolve over time for me, but their personal journey you have to have clarity on, this person's going to start like this and they're going to end up like this. And so for me, those arcs were actually the story. That was the whole, that was the engine that was driving the story. So they were really important, and they evolved in some cases, but for the most part, I started knowing who they were now and who I wanted them to be by the end of the book.
Excellent. I'll say Clayton in particular, he has a kind of rather dark dystopian origin. I mean, were you worried about making the tone maybe too dark? Because you know, there is some good humor in that book, and then there is some very dark moments.
Yes. I mean, mainly from a marketing standpoint, I think the book has a little bit of a kind of a young adult appeal, but then, you know, you throw in a few murders and a few, you know, disembodiments and drop a few F-bombs, and all of a sudden it starts to, you know, be a little older. But it felt like that was, you know, that's what the story needed. And for me, you know, the most disturbing parts are certainly the way the main characters end up orphaned, the deaths of the parents. That's very, you know, I have 2 young kids. That's tough stuff. But, you know, if a hero's going to be a hero, they got to have their parents killed. That's, you know, Batman, even Bambi. I mean, it's just I don't make the rules.
No, that's fair enough. Yeah, no parents equals a better story. I mean, poor old Harry Potter as well, even. I mean,
Exactly.
one of the other things as well is you have this world, you have these characters, and then you kind of developed your own sort of language and lexicon as well through this story. How did that develop?
That was almost a little bit of a throwaway, I think, in the introduction initially, where I said, oh, you know, they lived and they breathed the scriptures. They even spoke them. And I thought, oh, you know, I'll throw in a couple of, you know, what if they said this and they said that? And then I kind of didn't think about it again until somewhere in the middle or the end of the book. And I realized, well, our main characters probably need to be using some Chowderhead slang. And then I went back through and I kind of weaved it in, and I thought, and that's one of the things that sticks out for me. The print edition is a little bit of a richer experience in that regard, because there are footnotes for all of that slang throughout the book. And the footnotes are pretty entertaining and funny, because they are digging into some really outlandish and memorable stuff in comic books. And we tried to kind of explain some of those in the audiobook, but in many cases it was just too long-winded, and we just tried to rely on context.
No, fair enough. I mean, I've got both versions, so I've been trying to burn through the audio, but I have got the other one as well, so that's something to look forward to.
Because those footnotes are
because I do feel it is one of those books as well that the second time round you get a lot more than you did the first time. I feel
well,
at the moment.
So.
I haven't got to the end yet. But one of the biggest storylines in this book is the solving of the Cataclysm's challenge, and there are some very hardcore comic book trivia moments in that. How long did it take you to come up with these clues, and were there any clues that didn't make it into the book?
Well, so the clues, you're talking about the conundrum specifically, and the clues, I'd say, I mean, it's tough to do all that research, and there was some work involved there, but I have the advantage of Wikipedia, which the characters in the book do not. So I had to make sense of that. I'm like, I'm going to try to make this really hard, but if you have the internet, it's not going to be that hard. So I had to solve that. But the biggest challenge was working out the puzzle, which, if you look in the print edition, it's on the last page. And visually working out a crossword, and never mind a crossword that's wacky like this one, that's not what I do for a living. So that it took weeks to do all that thinking. And then, of course, there's the secret twist to it that went even deeper, to the point where I was like, I'm not sure, even with the internet, if I could solve this, which had to be true, because it took, you know, 10 or 15 years for the people in the books to solve it. So it had to be hard. But yeah, a lot of research there for sure.
Did you ever worry that some of the sort of knowledge and twists and turns might alienate some readers?
The comic book stuff specifically, I did worry that, you know, if you're not a comic book reader, are we going to lose you? And I was conscious of that from the start. So the way I wrote it was really, the tone is treating the reader like they don't know most of what's being told. So it's always, you know, oh, well, in this issue, this happened, and that's important because of this, which to a lot of the audience, the hardcore comic book audience, is going to be like, yeah, I know. But I was trying to walk that line a little bit, to pull in those people that are not hardcore comic book fans, and make it easier for them to experience the book, which obviously, ultimately, the story had to be strong enough so that the comic book stuff could be replaced with anything and still have the story be a fun ride. So that's the line I tried to walk. But at the end of the day, as we mentioned earlier, it's not a bad time to be writing a book about comics, because Marvel has created hundreds of millions of people that want to gobble up that content. So the audience, even if it was just comic book fans, I thought would be, it'd be a marketable product.
Cool. So how long was your total process in the development, the writing, all your research to finally having that finished draft in your hand? How did that feel? How long did that take?
Well, I'll tell you how it feels to have a finished draft when I get there. I was laboring over changes at the 11th hour, and one of the editors I worked with told me a funny story about a painter who was caught sneaking into the Louvre to make little adjustments to a painting that was hanging there. And Da Vinci said, art is never finished, it's only abandoned. And, if you've writing your first book, you really get that experience. I'm still leafing through and thinking, maybe I should change. I'm like, oh, I can't. Now it's in the world. So there's almost an anticlimactic thing there, in that you feel like once I get to the finish line, once I get the draft done, once I get to this milestone, whatever it is, but you're just constantly thinking, how could it be better? I mean, you should be anyway. So it's good to be done and be able to talk to other people about it and have people reading it, but of course there's always going to be things that'll nag at you, I think, for any artist.
No, that's fair enough. I mean, yeah, that is the artist thing, isn't it? It's never truly finished, as you say. And in getting this book published then, and then also with the emergence in sort of recent years of Audible as well, do you think that this could help you reach a bigger audience than, say, someone that might have just bought a book? Now, is it exposing the work more, would you say?
100%. I mean, I think if for no other reason, because you've got less competition, you've got tens of millions of books in print that you're competing with, whereas with audio it's merely hundreds of thousands, and that is meaningful. And that when you start cutting that up into categories and you start superhero science fiction, you can be in a pretty small pond by comparison to a book in a bookstore. But the other thing is, I think you're reaching people who are not only readers who might not see the book elsewhere, but you're reaching people who are not readers, because people are lazy now and don't want to actually read the book themselves. And I include myself in people. So you're getting, I think, an exponentially larger audience or exposure with what Audible has accomplished.
Excellent. I mean, how important was you to ensure that your book got the proper treatment in that? I mean, obviously you got Patton Oswalt on board. Was that something that was important to you as well? Because I mean, we've all had those audiobooks that are a great book but a bad listen. How was that important?
Yeah, that was incredibly important to me, because as a kid, my dad was, he grew up in the 40s listening to radio dramas and comedy shows. And when I was a kid, we'd go on a lot of road trips, and he'd buy, Jack Benny and the Green Hornet on audio cassette, and I'd listen to those. So I grew up listening to radio entertainment. And so that really steered my career a bit. I ended up doing a lot of kind of comedy radio advertising early in my career, and made a name for myself in that. So for me, doing the audiobook was really important, and getting it right, because that was a very kind of personal thing for me. And then Patton Oswalt, I frankly don't know how that happened. I mean, we reached out to his agent, told him what the book was about, and then we were talking about details. I mean, it was, I was shocked. I had a list of people, but he was at the top of the list. And, so we got into it, and I just have to say, he is, it makes sense, looking back, because he's working on MODOK, and, he was on Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. Like, he is a comic book icon himself. And, he's got the Black Hammer first issue out that he just wrote. He's amazing, the amount of work he's done, and specifically the amount of work in comic book stuff, as well as his professionalism and his patience, because yes, hundreds of radio spots I've directed. This is my first audiobook, and I wrote it. So as you can imagine, huge pain in the ass for everyone involved, because no, could you read that word? Like, could you go up at the end? But he was such a pro and so patient about it, and just so committed to getting the project done. I cannot express how grateful I am to him.
No, it was very good. So, what was the response like then? So you've made it, you've put all this time in, you've got the book ready, you've got the audio book ready, you've released it last December.
Yeah, bestseller. I'm ready to retire. No. So as you pointed out, the print edition came out late December, and then the audiobook really just came out a couple, 3 weeks ago, and we're seeing really the awareness of it jumping up with the audiobooks release. Great reception, good reviews and whatnot from folks, but we're, I think, starting to see a lot more momentum now that all the versions are out there, and it's very exciting.
Cool. And obviously the big question, with it being a book about comic books, when's the film coming out? Who's playing who? Who would your Dreamcast be?
Well, I've thought about that a lot, and mainly I've thought this could never be a movie, because you're talking about getting Marvel and DC and Disney and Warner Brothers all to get together on something.
Hey, Roger Rabbit
unless
happens.
it's going to be world peace. But I've thought, then again, it is possible. It would be amazing for the fans, and Marvel and DC have come together before on many things. They have that actual publisher that, what is it called? It's called the
Amalgam.
Yeah. So they do it, and if there's enough fan interest to see, if you can imagine that Danger Room scene on screen, it would be mind blowing. But even if you couldn't do that, we could rework it and have all the comic book references become kind of made up references. There are a number of made up titles in the book already, but do, like, the Sixth Sense, no, not the Sixth Sense, Unbreakable. What he did there was just create the world of comic books that he was working with. So there's potential there. But that's a bit of a different conversation, where
Yes.
High hopes, but it's a challenge.
It'll happen. And so what advice would you give then? Because I imagine there's writers everywhere who might have this idea that they're really trying to push forward, but there's obstacles in the way or whatever. What would be your advice to anyone out there who's writing at the moment?
Well, I think with any artistic pursuit, there's an actor that I heard a quote, and I don't even remember who the actor was, but it stuck with me through the years. It was, if you can do anything else, do that. Because any artistic pursuit, it's going to really put you to the test. But if you can't do anything else, then you have to commit fully, and you have to be prepared for the fact that it's going to take much longer than you want it to. It's going to be a very up and down road, even by yourself. In writing, it's such an isolated experience that, you have good days and bad, and you have days where you realize this wasn't worth doing and I have to give up. And then you say, no, I committed, I'm going to push through. And a week later, you're like, how could I possibly have thought that? And it's just back and forth. And you have to stick with it. And the joy of completing a thing, or the satisfaction, not necessarily joyful if you're, an OCD person that feels like you're never finished, but the satisfaction that you built something is really profound, especially when people start talking to you about it and giving you feedback on it. If you're going to do it, you've got to go all in. And I think the real piece of wisdom that came out of all this for me was, it's important in life to find your failure. That's what, in the middle of the process, I realized this may fail. I may never get it published, but that's okay. Because if I don't push forward, I will never know what my limits are until I meet them. And so I think that's really important as an artist, is just to get out there and see what you can do. And more importantly, ultimately, what you can't do. Because at that point, you gave everything, you did everything you could in life. And now you can settle back and just do the things that you're good at. But you've got to test yourself if you're going to bother with it.
No, definitely. No, it sounds like very, very good advice there. I mean, and then, give it a go. The next thing I would say to you then is, what's happening next? Have you got anything else in the pipeline? And also, how can our listeners stay up to date with what you're up to, what's going down?
I'm pretty active on Twitter, at Double J Walsh. You spell double out, because JJ Walsh was taken 17,000 times over. But I'm in the middle of a second book. I wrote during editing of this one, so I'm, that ought to be 6 months, 12 months, I suppose, out there in the world. But I also got I optioned a screenplay a little while ago that's may happen. It's called Faith Hardacre Meets the Devil, and it's about a parking cop that becomes a bounty hunter for Satan. And the pandemic has slowed things down there, but high hopes that production on that'll happen, and keep an eye out for it.
No, excellent. Well, I'd just like to thank you for taking the time to join us, and I look forward to reading that last couple of chapters. I'm very excited about it.
Absolutely. Really appreciate the time. It's been great talking to you.
Okay, Chowderhead Crusades, it's available now. Check out our show notes to find out how you can lay your hands on a copy. Don't forget to subscribe and rate us on your favourite podcast app, follow us on the socials, and check out the latest news and reviews at cultfaction.com. Until next time, goodbye.
Superman.